They told me I was banned from the very dirt that raised me before I even had the chance to put my truck in park. And I'm standing there, staring at a massive, cold slab of automated steel where our old, splintering wooden gate used to be, feeling the Montana frostbite into my neck while these two guys in tactical vests treat me like a common thief. I'd just driven 15 hours straight from Seattle, caffeine buzzing in my veins and a hollow pit of dread in my stomach because my old man, Silas, had collapsed near the creek and was currently hooked up to machines in a county hospital, and yet here I was being told by a guy named in quote, security in quote, that the Miller family ranch didn't exist anymore. It's a strange thing, you know, how your brain tries to process a lie that big. Because I grew up on this land, I knew every gopher hole and every rusted fence post from here to the Bitterroot Range. And suddenly, there's this shiny sign glaring at me under the high-altitude sun that says Emerald Crest Estates, private property, no trespassing. And I'm thinking, since when did a cattle ranch become a subdivision with a monthly fee? The lead guard, a guy with a neck thicker than a fence post and a pair of those wraparound sunglasses that make everyone look like an extra in a bad action movie, just smirked at me when I told him my name was Jackson Miller. He didn't oppose. To even look at my ID, he just tapped his clipboard and said, in quote, "Look, Mr. Miller or whoever you are, this road was annexed by the Emerald Crest HOA last Tuesday. And since you aren't an oppose, T on the resident white list and Don and oppose, T have a registered. Transponder, you're officially a trespasser, so why Don and oppose? T, you do us both a favor and turn that vintage scrap metal of a truck around before things get legal." End quote. My blood wasn't just boiling, it was evaporating because the end quote, scrap metal end quote, he was talking about was my father's 1994 Ford that I'd spent my high school years rebuilding, and the end quote, legal end quote. Part felt like a punch to the gut because my dad had warned me about this. He'd left me 3 voicemails in the week, leading up to his stroke, sounding more tired and paranoid with every message, saying the end quote, suits from the hill end quote, we're trying to choke him out, and God, it kills me to say it. I just told him he was being old and stubborn, that no one could just take a ranch that had been in the family for 4 generations. But as I sat there in the idling truck, watching the shadows of the pines stretch across the road like long, dark fingers, I realized the silence out here wasn't oppose. T, the peaceful kind anymore. It was heavy, the kind of silence that happens when something in oppose has been stolen and everyone's waiting to see if the owner notices. I didn't in oppose. TL, I didn't in oppose. T cause a scene. Not yet. I just looked that guard dead in his mirrored lenses and said, in quote, I hope you're getting paid a lot to stand on a dead man's signature, because when I come back, I'm not bringing a polite attitude. I'm bringing the truth, end quote. And I backed that truck up, gravel screaming under the tires, and headed straight for the county courthouse in Oak Haven, praying to a God I hadn't oppose. T spoken to in years that the law still meant something in a town that was starting to look more like a country club than a home. The courthouse smelled exactly the same. Stale coffee, old paper, and a hint of wet wool. And behind the glass sat Martha, a woman who had probably processed my birth certificate and my father's marriage license. And she looked at me with eyes so full of pity, I almost lost my footing right there on the linoleum. End quote. Jackson, honey, I heard about Silas, end quote. She whispered, her voice cracking as she leaned closer to the glass, end quote. But you need to know, things have gotten real ugly while you were away in the city. There's money moving through this office that doesn't end oppose. T have a face in your father's land. Well, it's been flagged for into oppose, accelerated development in oppose, under a public-private partnership. End quote. I asked her to show me the filing, the actual deed transfer or annexation order, and when she pulled it up on that flickering monitor, my heart didn't oppose. T just dropped. It stopped because there was a signature at the bottom of a, end quote, voluntary easement and annexation, end quote. Form that looked like my father's handwriting, but it was too perfect, too steady, and the date on it was the afternoon he was found unconscious in the dirt. End quote. Martha, end quote. I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from a mile away, end quote. My dad couldn't in oppose. T held a pen on Tuesday. His hands have been shaking with tremors for 2 years. He wouldn't in oppose. T signed a grocery list, let alone his soul away to a developer named Victor Sterling, end quote. And she just nodded slowly, looking over her shoulder to make sure the hallway was empty before she slid a thumb drive across the counter and told me to get out. to go see a man named Harlan who lived in a cabin up near the ridge, because Harlan was the only surveyor left who hadn't and oppos. Been bought by the HOAs and beautification fund, end quote. I spent the next 4 hours in Harlan's cabin, surrounded by topographical maps and the smell of wood smoke, watching this old man's eyes go wide as he compared the official county map to the one the HOA had filed. And he pointed a gnarled finger at a line that cut straight through our north pasture, right where the spring runs. End quote. They didn't in oppos. Just want the road, Jackson, end quote. Harlan spat, end quote. They wanted the water rights. They're planning to build a golf course for the new estates, and your father's spring is the only thing that'll keep the grass green. So they faked the boundary, moved the markers under the cover of the storm last week, and then into oppos, annexed in oppos, the road so you couldn't in oppos, to get in to see what they'd done to the creek, end quote. That was the moment the grief turned into a cold, sharp blade of clarity, because I realized this was and oppos. Just a group of Karens in yoga pants worried about the height of someone's grass. This was a corporate execution, a calculated attempt to erase my family's history, so a few billionaires could play 18 holes in the middle of a drought. I drove back to the ranch under the cover of a moonless sky, but I didn't into oppos. Go to the gate. I knew the old deer trails better than any security guard with a flashlight, and I hiked 3 miles through the brush until I reached the back of the main house, my childhood home, only to find the front door standing wide open and the interior looking like it had been hit by a localized hurricane. They weren't in oppos. Just looking for land. They were looking for the original deed, the one signed by the governor back in the late 1800s that carried a, end quote, perpetual use, end quote, clause which would make any HOA annexation legally impossible, and they'd ripped up the floorboards in my dad's office and smashed the urn on the mantel that held my mother's ashes just to find it. I was standing there, clutching a handful of dirt and ash, when the lights of a security SUV swept across the living room walls, and a voice over a megaphone told me to come out with my hands up because I was, end quote, violating a court-ordered eviction, end quote. And for a second, I almost gave up, almost let the weight of the city and the guilt of being a son who left take me down. But then I saw it, a small, glinting piece of metal tucked into the corner of the fireplace, something my dad had told me about when I was 10 years old, a hidden safe built into the masonry that only opened if you knew which stone to press. And, as the, end quote, guards, end quote, started kicking the back door, my fingers found the latch, and I pulled out a leather-bound ledger that contained every original land grant, every tax receipt, and most importantly, a secret recording device my dad had started carrying when the HOA president, a woman named Victoria Thorne, started showing up at his door with, end quote, offers he couldn't and oppos, refuse, end quote. I didn't in oppos, walk out the front door, I went out the cellar, and by the time they realized the house was empty, I was already back at the gate, but this time I wasn't into oppos. In my truck, I was behind the wheel of my dad's old D9 Caterpillar bulldozer that had been sitting in the machine shed for a decade, its engine roaring to life with a cloud of black smoke that felt like a middle finger to the entire, end quote, emerald crest, end quote, aesthetic. I didn't in oppos. Stop. I didn't in oppos. Slow down. I watched through the reinforced glass as the, end quote, security guards, end quote, scrambled out of their little guard shack, screaming about lawsuits and police, and I drove that 10-ton beast right through their polished steel gate, crushing it into the dirt like it was a soda can, and I didn't in oppos. Stop until I'd pushed the ruins of their, end quote, private entry, end quote, sign all the way back to the highway. The next morning was and oppos, a quiet one, because by the time the sheriff arrived, the real sheriff, not the deputies on the HOA payroll, I was sitting on the porch of the ranch house with a thermos of coffee, the leather ledger on my lap, and the audio recording of Victoria Thorne openly admitting to, end quote, greasing the wheels, end quote, at the clerk's office and threatening to, end quote, make sure Silas never woke up, end quote. If he didn't in oppos, TS. IGN the papers. The look on her face when the handcuffs clicked shut was better than any sunset I've ever seen over the mountains. But even as the truck started rolling out and the, end quote, private property, end quote, signs were torn down, the town felt different, fractured, and I'm sitting here now, looking at the scar on the earth where that gate used to be, wondering if you can ever really go home once the world has decided your home is an investment opportunity. My dad woke up 2 days later, and the first thing he asked wasn't an oppos, about the land or the money. He just looked at me and asked if the gate was open, and I told him it was, and that it was never going to be closed again. But I see these stories everywhere now. People being pushed off their land by, in quote, associations, in quote, and in quote, community boards, in quote, that act like they're the high court of the land. And it makes me wonder, is it just a matter of time before we're all just tenants on our own property, or is there still enough grit left in the dirt to fight back? I'm keeping the bulldozer gassed up, just in case, because I've learned one thing through all of this. A fence only works if you're afraid to tear it down, and I'm not afraid anymore. What do you guys think? Is an HOA ever actually about, in quote, community, in quote, or is it just a way for people with a little bit of power to feel like they own their neighbors? Have you ever had a fight for what was yours? Or do you think I went too far with the bulldozer? Drop a comment below. I want to know if I'm the hero of this story or just the man who broke the peace, because from where I'm sitting, the peace was a lie anyway.